wrong is this extremely tight pants. It's not appropriate for a Christian. Do you remember that many homosexuals are in the clothing industry and doing the designing?
Oh boy, now we're going off the rails.
Don't you know they love it when you're wearing tight pants?
Our clothes fit well, but not too well.
If you're unfamiliar, this is governing body member Tony Morris, governing body of Jehovah's Witnesses. And he was actually added to the governing body in 2005, from what I could tell. Now, there were previously 8 governing body members, but as it turns out, there are now 10 of them. They just added 2 governing body members. This throws a wrench into Jehovah's Witnesses theology like you wouldn't believe, and they're just pretending it didn't.
What a fitting picture of the final end of all of God's enemies. Sobering, yet something we look forward to. However,
the guy just went through graphically describing what was going to happen to people like me, people who have left Jehovah's Witnesses behind to pursue some other religion or no religion at all, walked away, weren't trying to pull people out, weren't trying to argue with them or cause problems for them or anything, just want to walk away from the religion. That's it. He calls people like that enemies of God. And he just described a very brutally graphic scene for what's going to happen to them in the end, quote unquote. Listen to what he says next.
The apostates and the enemies of Jehovah would say, well, that's gruesome, that's despicable. You teach your people these things? No, God teaches his people these things. This is what he's foretelling. And frankly, for friends of Jehovah God, how reassuring that they're finally going to be gone. All these despicable enemies that have just reproached Jehovah's name, destroyed, never, ever to live again.
No, I couldn't play the more graphic part because it is entirely too much, trust me. But to revel in the deaths of somebody, I don't revel in anyone's death.
Now, it's not that we rejoice in someone's death, but when it comes to God's enemies, finally.
Kind of sounds like you're reveling in someone's death to me. Am I mistaken? So let me tell you why it throws a wrench into the theology, and we're going to talk a little bit about the governing body members, the new ones. This is one of them right here. Gage Flegel? I don't know what his name is exactly. Gage, never heard it before. Pretty metal name, if I do say so myself. So that makes a total of 9 white guys and 1 black guy. Pretty diverse crew they've got on the governing body.
The year was 608 BCE. The prophet Jeremiah had already served nearly 40 years faithfully.
Yeah, so that's Gage Flegel, and the other one is Jeffrey Winder. It's this fine-looking gentleman right here.
How would you students answer this question? Do you feel closer to Jehovah now than you did before your Gilead training began?
Let me give you a better formed idea of the types of things that the governing body members believe before I explain what this massive wrench is that just wrecked everything in their theology. I mean, you got a good idea of what Tony Morris believes and who he is, but let's watch one more from the guy. This one came out September 5th, 2022.
Personally, when I was in the traveling work, sometimes I'd be working with one of the brothers or one of the sisters, and they had opposition in some of the territories we'd work in.
They're getting harassed, basically, when they're going knocking on doors.
And I could tell they were feeling the stress, and I knew it was the reaction of some of these householders. So what I used to enjoy doing, and they appreciated after they realized what I was doing, we'd be walking along, and then I'd just stop, and I'd look up, and I'd say, "You see him?" And they're like, "Who?" He's right up there above the trees.
Okay, yeah. So here's why that's so funny. In Jehovah's Witness theology, they don't believe that anybody has the capability to communicate with God or to see angels, except special anointed people, only 144,000 of them through history. most of which are Jehovah's Witnesses. Now, back in the 80s or the 90s, they believed that once 144,000 anointed people were reached, the end would come. So there was like a big push for people to come out and claim to be anointed, basically. When they reached that threshold of 144,000 and went over even, and the end didn't come, they said it was closed off. Now, over time, people came out and admitted, okay, maybe I'm not anointed. I thought I was. The barrier to entry to being anointed is simply you believe it with all of your heart. You feel like God told you that you are. And what makes you special when you're anointed is the belief that you receive divine prophecy directly from God and that you will go to heaven after Armageddon. Everybody else, the great crowd within Jehovah's Witness theology, is going to stay on earth and live in a Garden of Eden 2.0, basically. Eventually, after the 90s, they kind of opened the anointed thing back up for people quietly, and you saw some people come out and admit to being anointed or claim to be anointed. You have to be anointed to be a governing body member. It's a requirement. If you aren't anointed, then it means you have no right to run the organization because you're not getting divine information from God, and God's supposed to be leading the organization, right? Well, here's the interesting thing. Jeffrey Winder and Gage Flegel, to my knowledge, were not anointed up until very, very recently. And at like 50 years old or something like that, which is exceedingly young for a governing body member, at 50-something years old, they came out and said, yep, we're anointed, and then they get added to the governing body. They were previously helpers. So now that you have that context, you'll understand why it's so ridiculous that Tony Morris would pretend to point out angels to people that he was walking with. Normal Jehovah's Witnesses can't see angels, and they don't claim to see angels. But as a governing body member, he was standing there claiming to see angels, okay? Just ridiculous, dude. That's not the only ridiculous thing about this guy, Tony Morris, or the rest of the governing body members. They're all absurd people. I mean, Tony Morris seems to have this weird obsession with tight pants. Listen to this one. I think this is 2015 in Trinidad.
So it's not that you don't dress nice to fit your physique. That's fine. That's what Max and I do. What's wrong is this extremely tight pants. It's not appropriate for a Christian. And I want you brothers to think about this. Do you remember that many, many, many homosexuals are in the clothing industry and doing the designing?
Oh boy, now we're going off the rails.
Don't you know they love it when you're wearing tight pants? Oh yeah, you chuckle. I don't think it's funny. I think it's disgusting.
Yeah, so that's Tony Morris. Those are some of the bizarre views. He even fits it into, like, the kids' cartoons that he designs or that he, like, contributes to with the writing and stuff. Caleb is preparing to go in service, and they're talking about personal appearance. Go in service means go door knocking.
Personal appearance. How we look is very important because we represent Jehovah. Getting ready for the ministry, we need to make sure our appearance is saying the right things. Jehovah wants your appearance to be well-arranged and modest. What that means is that we look and smell clean. Our clothes fit well, but not too well.
Seriously, they fit this in everywhere they can because he has this weird obsession with it. Anyway, yeah, Tony Morris is not the only weird one. There are a lot of really weird governing body members. This is probably one of the more famous clips of Stephen Lett. He's another governing body member. I believe he was added in 1999. Again, Tony Morris was 2005. I think the longest serving governing body member is Garrett Loesch, but we'll take a look at him in a bit. Check this clip out from Stephen Lett.
So the events unfolding around us are making clearer than ever that we're living in the final part of the last days, undoubtedly the final part of the final part of the last days, shortly before the last day of the last days.
Something tells me this guy has no idea what he's talking about. So anyways, let me explain why it's such a big deal that they just added 2 new governing body members. There's something called the second generation teaching, okay? And it's a really complicated teaching. I'm going to try to simplify it as much as possible. When the religion was first founded back in the late 1800s, I believe 1870-something, 1860-something maybe, it was based on a religion called Millerism. They called themselves Millerites. Now, the Millerites came up with some Bible math and calculated that the end would come by 1842, I believe. Everybody in the organization, every Millerite, got everyone hyped up, started spreading the word, and excited about it and all that stuff, and nothing happened, of course. So they said to themselves, I know, we got the Bible math right, except there's no year 0. We miscalculated. It just goes from 1 BCE to 1 CE. So if we just add a year to the calculation, it'll land us at 1843, and that's actually when the end is going to come. Everybody sells all their stuff and gives it to the church so they can spread the word, and nothing happened, of course. It was called the Great Disappointment. At that point, the Millerite church shattered into 3 factions. The first faction believed that the Bible math was wrong, nothing was going to happen, it was completely made up. The second faction believed they had the Bible math right, they just had the calculations wrong. They had to plug in different variables. And the third faction believed something really did happen. Jesus really did come back. He just came back invisibly. So time passes, and Charles Taze Russell, the founder of Jehovah's Witnesses, and Ellen G. White, the founder of Seventh-day Adventists, meet each other at a church. They were going to a church together simultaneously, the same church. The part of the Millerite movement that they were a part of believed they had the variables wrong. So Charles Taze Russell, around 1870-something, changes the variables, comes up with a new idea for when he thinks the end is going to be, and his calculation landed him firmly at 1878. That was supposed to be, quote-unquote, the end of the harvest. I think he started the religion in 1874 of Jehovah's Witnesses and then predicted 1878 as the end. He had another prediction in 1881, a revised end of the harvest when nothing happened. He changed the variables once again. When nothing happened, he actually calculated 1913. When nothing happened in 1913, he said, you know what? There's no year 0. I totally forgot. So actually, it's not 1913, it's 1914. Sounding familiar? When the 1914 prediction failed, Charles Taze Russell realized he couldn't continue on with this. So he said, something really did happen. It was just invisible. Jesus came back invisibly in 1914. Sound familiar? Really? This dude copied the Millerites word for word multiple times. Okay, he's plagiarizing their ideas. Anyways, Charles Taze Russell dies in 1916, Halloween night, and Joseph Rutherford takes over. Joseph Rutherford claims in 1919 that something special is going to happen. He moves the prediction forward. It's 1919 now. Nothing happened, of course. So instead of pretending they didn't make that prediction, they added that to their repertoire and claimed, actually, Jesus came back in 1914 invisibly, hung around for 5 years, checked things out, saw that Jehovah's Witnesses were running things properly, as a proper religion should, and in 1919, he decided to go back to heaven after choosing Jehovah's Witnesses as his organization that represents him on earth. So 1914, Jesus comes back. 1919, Jesus goes back to heaven after choosing Jehovah's Witnesses as their given religion. Actually, it was the Bible students at the time. In 1933, Joseph Rutherford did a hostile takeover, fired the entire board of directors or whatever, and named himself the president and renamed it to Jehovah's Witnesses from the Bible students. And then he banned beards because he didn't want anyone to be reminded of his predecessor, Charles Taze Russell, who had a gigantic beard. They're banned to this day with Jehovah's Witnesses. Anyways, that's beside the point. So here's where the second generation teaching comes in. All through the 1920s, Joseph Rutherford made the claim that the generation alive to witness the events that took place in 1914, they would not pass away. That generation would not pass away. That was the claim. You have to have been anointed before 1914 to be considered part of that generation. When they describe the second generation teaching, the governing body, they make note of the fact that one of the governing body members from the 80s and 90s, Fred Franz, was anointed in 1913 and served on the governing body until 1994 or something like that, I think. They consider him to be the generation. Well, unfortunately, he died. He's been dead for 20-something, 30 years, right? So how do they explain it now? The second generation is here. The world is supposed to end within the time frame of the first generation. The apocalypse was supposed to come before the first generation passed away. And here we sit 30 years later. So they came out here, the governing body, and changed the interpretation of the second generation teaching to mean anybody who was alive and anointed during the time that anybody was alive and anointed during the time that Jesus came back, i.e., anybody who was alive and anointed during the time that Fred Franz was involved in the movement or whatever, involved in the governing body. That's what they're saying. So they just extended it about 25 more years. They gave themselves an additional 25 years, which, unfortunately for them, is running up. So here's why it's such a train wreck that they just added 2 new people to the governing body. The people on the governing body now, when they die, that's it. The second generation teaching has been proven wrong. The end should be here before the governing body members that are on there now pass away. They're in their 60s or their 70s. If they need to add new governing body members, they lied. And everybody knows that. Every Jehovah's Witness knows that. They know of the second generation teaching. They know the hypocrisy that they just perpetrated by adding 2 new people. There is no reason for them to have added 2 new people. As a matter of fact, those people were already governing body helpers. They were already taking part in all of the stuff that the governing body does. They didn't need to add them to the governing body unless they expect some of the governing body members to pass away. Unless they expect to carry this on for a 3rd generation, this doesn't make any sense. And these governing body members are really young. They're like 50 to 55 years old, these new ones. Why are they adding young governing body members who were anointed after Fred Franz died? That makes no sense at all. These governing body members, the original 8 that were on the governing body up until this moment, I suppose that they could get a pass if they were anointed before Fred Franz died. But these new ones did not. These new ones were not anointed. So I don't know what they think they're doing, but they're definitely throwing a wrench into the works and confusing the hell out of a lot of Jehovah's Witnesses right now. So I wanted to watch just like 1 or 2 clips of these guys just to kind of get a feel for who they are. This is Jeffrey Winder. Let's just listen to a few seconds of this.
How would you students answer this question? Do you feel closer to Jehovah now than you did before your Gilead training began?
Right. So I guess he's leading like a Gilead training something or other, like the congratulations speech or whatever. Okay.
The answer is a resounding yes, isn't it?
Did he just answer for them?
Maybe you can relate to these comments of graduates of past classes of Gilead. One brother said, absolutely yes. I believe I now experience more fully what it means to walk with God and know and rely upon him as a close friend, not merely someone I turn and look up to in prayer. A sister said, Gilead definitely drew me closer to Jehovah. The way we studied the scriptures with intensity truly made me feel like the Bible was a letter Jehovah wrote to me. Another brother said, Jehovah communicated with such clarity, which made it real and personal. It made me feel closer to Jehovah than ever before, and that feeling will never be forgotten.
God, just their personality is so weird. Just Jehovah's Witnesses in general, particularly the personalities of the governing body members, it's so stiff and plastic and fake. Is it just me? Let's take a look at Gage Flegel. It's this guy here.
The year was 608 BCE. The prophet Jeremiah had already served nearly 40 years faithfully. And now he was confined in the courtyard of the guard in Jerusalem. Jerusalem's walls were being battered by the Babylonians. In less than a year, the entire city would be completely destroyed. But Jeremiah had to weather the storm. There was no way out. There was no place for him to go. He was under lockdown.
Why is he smiling about this? This seems like an inappropriate time to smile. Is it just me? Jehovah's Witnesses believe that the fall of the first temple took place in 607 BCE.
The year was 608 BCE. In less than a year, the entire city would be completely destroyed.
Now, why does that matter? Because that is one of the variables that they use to arrive at the conclusion that Jesus came back in 1914. And we believed that that's when it was, in 1914, when these calculations were originally done. But the rest of the world has done its research and found that actually the temple fell in 587, not 607, 30 years later. And we know that without a shadow of a doubt because we have cuneiform tablets from Babylon. Apparently, it turns out the Babylonians kept records like you wouldn't believe. They kept records of everything, like receipts of every purchase and every sale. And on the receipts, they put the stars, like the formation of the stars, which we can look at and use to determine exactly when that was, at what moment in time that receipt was written out on cuneiform tablets. Because the stars will not align that way for another 1,000 or 2,000 years. So we know exactly, practically to the day, when the temple fell. But Jehovah's Witnesses absolutely insist that it actually fell 30 years earlier, despite the new evidence that we got to show us exactly when it fell. They refuse to accept that they're wrong on this, which makes sense. You know, their entire theology is discredited if it didn't happen in 607 like they originally claimed, which it didn't, of course.
Well, have you ever felt like Jeremiah, as if the world was caving in on you? Maybe it was a serious health scare, the health of a loved one, the death of a loved one.
Dude, I swear to God, they are just the most plastic people alive. I mean, I was like that too when I was a Jehovah's Witness, so I can't really blame them for that one. It's just weird, man. Just weird. And for good measure, let's just listen to the other governing body member, Stephen Lett, rail against feminism for a second. That's this guy right here.
There's a lot of groups in today's world that would have our sisters believe to be in subjection to a man is belittling. It's demeaning. There's groups like Women's Lib. One brother called it Women's Lip, L-I-P instead of L-I-B, you know. Just change a letter there. See, there's groups like that say, don't let any man tell you what to do.
See, just, I don't even know what to say about it, dude. They're terrible, some of them. Like, some of the stuff that they've said and done is absolutely terrible. And you know what upsets me the most about the governing body of Jehovah's Witnesses? Every one of them are anointed. Like I said, every one of them claims to hear the voice of God directly. They could claim that God told them to do this thing or that thing or whatever else, and every one of the other governing body members would believe them. They could say, Jehovah told me that we need to stop protecting people who take advantage of children. We need to stop protecting CSA. And just like that, boom, every other governing body member, all 9 others, would take that and say, you know what, Jehovah told you, let's figure this out, let's do it. Any one of them could come out tomorrow and say, we need to stop shunning people. This is wrong. Jehovah told me we have to stop shunning. And just like that, tomorrow, shunning would end, and I would talk to my mother again. But they don't. They don't do any of that stuff. You know why? Because they don't have any interest in making this organization more humane or better or nicer. They have no interest in improving people's living conditions. They have an interest in controlling the people around them. That's it. And here we have 2 new people who have the same vested interest. I don't think much is going to change now that these people have been added to the governing body. But these guys have been helpers for a long time, so I suspect if anything does change, it's probably going to change for the worse. Let me know what you think about it in the comments.